So I may be naive, but I tend to believe that many more people than we imagine, maybe even most people, are actually kind of brilliant, that they're potential geniuses, but their spark was systematically snuffed out or extinguished when they were young. So many of us grew up in situations that really didn't support the cultivation of our unique essence or our singular gifts. And in a normative culture organized around material productivity and social control, people kind of learn from childhood on that they have to redirect the vast majority of their genius, their intellectual, intuitive, and creative gifts toward suppressing their own expressiveness, repressing their life force, mutilating their own brilliance in a sense. And instead of becoming like poetic geniuses, they become geniuses at conforming. They become masters at the art of self-amputation and self-suppression. In his book, Eros and Civilization, Herbert Marcuse wrote about what he called surplus repression. And his idea is that people internalize social hierarchy and domination so completely that they actually learn to police themselves more rigorously than any external authority would actually require of them. And there's almost a kind of weird, kind of like dark pleasure or jouissance, to use a Lacanian term, in this self-policing. There's almost like a perverse satisfaction people get when their superego is able to kind of like crush any stray thoughts and errant desires that come up in them. The censoring mechanism becomes, in a sense, the connoisseur of its own cruelty, and as well as its cruelty towards others who won't get in line. So perhaps it is precisely this force of surplus repression, this kind of compulsive, almost like automatic self-negation that happens as we get older, that shapes collapsing authoritarian societies like our own today. And this connection really struck me late last night when I learned the Supreme Court is allowing the Trump regime to stop paying SNAP benefits to 47 million people, many at big risk of hunger. I've also been reading Allie Beth Stuckey's Toxic Empathy. This is a book by a right-wing Christian influencer trying to understand how people who claim to follow Christ-like, impulses, such as the conservative judges of the Supreme Court, can be so callous and seemingly just like spectacularly cruel to people who, don't have all the privileges and all the wealth. I've also been reading a very compelling, different book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by a psychologist, Joy DeGruy. So she's a mental health clinician, and she looks at how centuries of slavery still shape the U.S. They shape the psychology of Black people in the U.S. whose ancestors grew up in slavery. They shape, the psychology of the white people who were involved in slavery. And it's still this sort of primary psychological and cultural condition from which we've never healed as a country. So she actually notes that racism has run like a poison through the blood of American society since the Europeans first landed on these shores. And since that beginning, America and Americans have invested much in denying it. Americans' denial of their blatant racism and the attending atrocities committed throughout the nation's history has become pathological. Such denial has allowed this illness to fester for almost 400 years. It is what keeps this country sick with this issue of race. So I think that's a very interesting perspective, and we should remember it when we think about this white Christian nationalism and its idea of toxic empathy that liberals are somehow plagiarized or infected by this toxic empathy. So what Stuckey and her Christian nationalist allies have done is kind of ingenious in a dark way. They've constructed a theory, a theological model that transforms indifference into virtue. So toxic empathy in this framing is a sin of feeling too much for the suffering of others, particularly people who are, quote unquote, undeserving, the poor, the weak, the dependent. Empathy gets pathologized as a liberal disease, a sentimentality that enables dysfunction and rewards victimhood. So in this kind of moral vision, cruelty gets rebranded as tough love, and withdrawing care is almost seen as an act of like spiritual strength or spiritual hygiene. It's better to abandon the poor so they can be saved, in a way, quote unquote, from themselves. And in the book, Stuckey even looks at a very sympathetic case. This woman, Maribel, a Mexican woman, I guess the Washington Post did a story on this. She crossed the border illegally in 2002. She got married here. She applied for asylum. Eventually, she was approved to work and live in the U.S. She would check with immigration authorities every year. There are a lot of cases like this now. She was raised 4 children in Fairfield, Ohio, including she has a 3-year-old daughter with epilepsy. And, Stuckey admits that this woman built a good, quiet life for their family, their home, the community, a place that they loved raising their children. But when Trump returned to office, Maribel got arrested without warning. She was deported back to Michoacan, Mexico, which is an area plagued by gang violence and so on. And now she only gets to speak to her children on video chats. She can't touch them. She can't help her daughter and so on. So then Stuckey has to kind of justify this inhuman behavior, this cruelty, and she does it by invoking a handful of highly publicized crimes, murders committed by undocumented immigrants in the U.S., even though we know that native-born Americans commit far more crimes per capita. So then Stuckey warns, kind of Trump-like ominously about cartels, drugs, sex slaves, exploiting our quote-unquote porous border. And she includes, quote, "We can feel for people like Maribel while still keeping in mind the big picture. Mass illegal immigration enabled and encouraged by our leaders wreaks unnecessary and preventable havoc on our nation." Okay, I mean, there's a lot of questions we could raise about that statement. I mean, what her, kind of overview conveniently ignores is kind of the actual big picture, elements of it. The U.S. has depended since the 60s or 50s on massive influxes of both legal and illegal immigration, which we needed to fill low-wage jobs, agriculture jobs, industrial jobs. Native-born Americans refused to do it. And we also, at the same time, through our economic policies, were destabilizing countries across the global South through the International Monetary Fund, structural adjustment programs, through our trade policies, and the ways that our corporations would kind of corrupt governments and then extract resources from them. So we can see that our consumption of the lion's share of global CO2 and other resources has accelerated the environmental collapse in these regions, forcing mass migration. So, for instance, I live in New York City, in East Village, and there was a refugee processing center that in an abandoned school on my corner last year, and there was a lot of African men lining up there every day, and I found out that a lot of them come from Ivory Coast, and then I discovered that apparently the Ivory Coast is the largest producer of chocolate in the world. I think it's way more than 50% of the world's chocolate is produced there. And Nestle's and Hershey's are the main companies that have sort of corrupted the government there. They've deforested. 50% of the country is now deforested. And for the workers who work in the cacao plantations, they make an incredibly bad, 78 cents a day. And meanwhile, with the deforestation, they can't, live in a self-sufficient way. So, what happens is that families will choose one of their able-bodied young men and raise enough money to fly them to Central America or South America, and they'll just walk north for, it could be months, even a year, if it's from Brazil, trying to get across the border, because if they can get a job in the U.S. making $10, $12, $15 an hour delivering for DoorDash or something, that's obviously, so much money for them that they can send back to their families. So that example of chocolate and Ivory Coast, that's repeated in all these countries all over the world, which we really, created markets and profit centers for our corporations. And we've really, created a lot of this problem. So, when we make this, when people like Stuckey and Trump and everybody make these arguments against illegal immigration, they present them in this kind of hermetically sealed way, like this vacuum that just erases the centuries of imperial policy that produced these crises in the first place. So I don't want to say that Stuckey is consciously a hypocrite. She might be, but I think it's actually more disturbing. What she's put together is a sort of a coherent ideological system that has kind of inverted traditional Christian morality. What we're really witnessing is the culmination of a long theological project, one that has weaponized Christian rhetoric to kind of sanctify inequality and authoritarian lawlessness. Stuckey and her audience may believe they're enacting compassion by refusing to enable weakness, but instead they've really performed a kind of psychologically alchemical act. They've taken their own surplus repression, their sense of self-throttling, and they've contorted that, turned it into a moral system. And having mastered the sort of, unfortunate art of denying their own needs and impulses, suppressing their own vulnerabilities and desires and eccentricities, they now, demand the same kind of sacrifice from others. It's like the superego has crushed the vulnerable self, and then it starts to project that logic outward. It's as if they're saying, you must suffer as I have suffered. You must make yourself small as I have made myself. And, when, of course, we know this white Christian nationalism ideology goes totally against the core teaching of the Gospels. If you go back to, Christ's original teachings, maybe not what came later in the New Testament by the church fathers or whatever. So if you go back to Matthew, Jesus says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. When his followers asked when they saw him in these conditions, Christ replied, truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. So the instruction from the Gospels is very clear. You're supposed to feed the hungry and help the poor. And the hungry person that you help is Christ himself. It is this sort of messianic being or force. So, withholding this food from 47 million people, it's not tough love. It's a total rejection of charity, compassion, divine justice, just everything that's expressed directly in the Gospels. And so the teaching of the Gospels directly negates this toxic empathy kind of shtick of Stuckey and other, Christian white nationalists and Supreme Courts, zealots who somehow believe Trump is sent by God to bring about the rapture for the white people. The Sermon on the Mount is a foundational text of Christianity, and also could not be any clearer. It talks about, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they'll be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. That's from Matthew. Later, from the same sermon, give to everyone who begs from you. Do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. In Luke, it gets even more explicit. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. The whole point is to lend to your enemies, love your enemies, do good, and lend expecting nothing in return. So then you have the Christian mystical tradition, which could be considered the heart of, the Christian faith, also points in the opposite direction. Like somebody like Meister Eckhart, for instance, he preached a radical dispossession of the self and its greed and so on. Instead of promoting, cruelty and miserliness, he thought Christians should seek to become, open to divine love, which is kind of infinite. He said, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. So the moment you truly see another person, you're seeing with God's eyes, which means you're seeing yourself, you're seeing the Christ. The hungry person is not an other. Their hunger is your hunger. It's Christ's hunger. So the mystics recognize that separation is really itself the wound or the sin in a way. And, love and charity don't calculate or withhold. Love is to dissolve the boundaries between self and the suffering of the other. So once again, the calculated cruelty of the Supreme Court and of this toxic empathy woman is very immoral, completely untenable, and completely goes against the faith that they profess. There's another tradition within Catholicism, which is very popular in the Global South, is liberation theology, which insists that God actually makes a preferential option for the poor, not because poverty is virtuous in itself, but because God's love innately flows towards those who are under the boot, who are crushed by systems of domination. And you have people like Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff and their comrades who really understood that the gospel is taking a side with the oppressed against the oppressor, with the hungry against those who hoard, and so on. And so if you're going to follow Christ in this interpretation, you would work selflessly for the overthrow of exploitation structures that produce starvation, homelessness, and unnecessary despair. And we should recognize that a society which is willing to allow 47 million people to go hungry while billionaires accumulate obscene wealth is not just unjust, it is absolutely blasphemous according to the Christian faith. It desecrates the image of God in every human being. So, it's pretty extraordinary how these white Christian nationalists have abandoned the mystical core, the essential meaning of their own faith. And, the imperative we're stated again and again in the Gospels is to dissolve the ego and serve the least among us. And that's been replaced by a technological theology of merit, a Calvinist hall of mirrors where, kind of wealth and privilege signal divine favor, and poverty and want and deprivation represent a moral failure. And the Supreme Court's cruelty may be draped in cold legalese, but it's clearly a deep betrayal of Christianity. It's Christianity without a Christ. It's a faith that destroys rather than heals.